Effie Shum Steiner.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much all for gathering for this very, very exciting event. My name is Effie Shoam. I'm the head of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Inter-Religious Encounters at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba. I would not interrupt uh, and would not take the baton away from Peter Leonard unless these were very irregular times. I should say that, as all of you know, both in Europe, in Israel, in the United States, that we're kind of experiencing a very troublesome and turbulent moment in Israel at this time. And I would like to hope that this event, which is pre-planned and we envisioned it even before COVID-19, will eventually come to fruition and move and forward flawlessly. But so I would say keep your fingers crossed, say a Kapitel Tilim or whatever, so that this would cross the waters, the troublesome waters of these current times as flawlessly as possible. I want to thank you all for joining us. This is an important moment for us, for Rainer. And at this, I hand it over to Peter, and I'm Salim. Erev Tov lekulam.
Okay. I am mute? No, I'm not mute. Okay. Good evening. I'm very pleased to open an evening planned long before COVID-19 and is realized more than a year later. But it's, as we all know, pro capto lectoris habens sua fata libelli. So it's our duty, yet even in somehow estranging situation here in Israel today, to give a book the chance to meet potential readers. And this is the raison d'etre of this evening, to meet about the book of Rainer. So this evening has 4 parts. I try to give some of the framework of the series and the project of the Monumenta, to show the background and just also to give the context of some, how to say, peculiarities of the book of Rainer, where you had hard to work with, hard to struggle with, but finally come to a good and a very successful end. And I opened my yesterday morning Zoom lecture with the students with the anecdote about the generals of the Spartan leader, how they put it before the Battle of Thermopylae, as they heard that the Persians under Xerxes had 10,000 of arrows to fire at the Spartans. And they answered in a laconic response, "So we shall fight in the shadow." Or referring nevertheless to the situation here, so we have to study in the shadow of. Okay. So the idea that I'm more in the blues mood of jumping at shadows of Peter Green, but a book event that should have been around a big table in daylight. Okay, but let's hope that we'll return to these options. And now I'll keep straightforward to keep the event in the frame of about an hour. Let's begin with introducing the book project of Rainer Barzen and its editorial context. I'll take this task on me, and I'll just say to my part, to my contribution here, that I'm a senior lecturer of Hebrew medieval literature, but also had my share in as editorial tutor of bringing Hebrew text to print in the framework of the book of Rainer into the framework of the Monumenta project. Okay, so now let's begin. First of all, the pictures of Rainer improved with every promotion publication of the things. Now is even smiling. This is very, very true for the whole process. Okay, now let me begin this crazy project of the Monumenta Germania Historica. In Israel, there are too many peoples that are dealing with the Middle Ages that are not used to open these kinds of books. And even more, that the background of this series that fills shelves in the libraries is not very well known over here. If someone meets one book of it, he does not understand what the 200, 300, 400 others doing around the same shelves. And so I try to introduce some aspect of this general project of the Hebrew series, and afterwards about the layout of the quite Mikraot Gedolot Talmudic layout of the books of this series. Okay, so the Monumenta Germania Historica is now giving themselves the name of Basic Research of Middle Ages, was founded in 1819. And it was based on the concept of nation in the era of Romanticism. A nation is geographic continuity, genetic continuity, continuity in language and culture. Okay, this was very interesting for Germany in those days. There was still no nation with state boundaries or no nation state around. The genetic continuity opened the idea of developing of European racism and ethnic cleansing in the concept of ethnic cleansing of the states. And the continuity in language and culture brought up a fight in every state for canonization of the resources and of normalization, even of the writing. Yes, because nobody could write in every form and publish in every form 200 years ago. But for this kind of national project, Middle Ages and Judaism are a challenge. Exile and multi-ethnicity are not fitting to geographic continuity. Conversion puts genetic continuity even inside of Judaism to dust, because if the third generation can be the high priest, so what is genetic continuity? And the problem of multilingualism was one of the main challenges in the Middle Ages. Everybody could speak some languages to get around in town. So multilingualism is one of the most important phenomena. When Reichsfreiherr Heinrich von Stein launched the project, he was stressing the third point: continuity in language and culture. So this was to give the possibility to read the sources of German culture. Okay, and they choose as a sign, yes, the Sanctus Amor Patriae Dat Animum, and we have to translate it a little bit other than the open formulation. The holy love of the fatherland gives the right spirit, not the leftish spirit, not the liberal spirit, but the right spirit. And this we can see in all aspects of the project, that no Jews are mentioned in German history, that no women, because they are from the different sex, so they have no place there, and so on and so on. This was, on the one side, a very, very hard beginning for medieval cultural studies. But on the other hand, the first 50 years produced a huge amount. The sources of the basic unification of Germany in the second half of the 19th century. There were dozens of books of historiography in Latin. Oh, not German. Okay. There were laws and constitutions in Latin. Okay. There were charters from the royal houses and so on. There were letters. The antiquities, the poetry and the necrologies, everything was in Latin. Okay, so, but later on, after a few hundred volumes, some 200 or something like this, they began also in the 20th century with new sources, Quellen zur Geistesgeschichte, sources for intellectual history, travelogues, and last but not least, 2003, die hebräische Texte aus dem mittelalterlichen Deutschland. That's the Hebrew text from medieval Germany, in cooperation with the Israeli Academy of Sciences and the spiritus rector, above all, who connected the academies and so on, is and was and is Professor Benjamin Ze'ev Kedar. And now what this project was made for. They called it in the 2019 200 years Festschrift, they called it Mittelalter lesbar machen, to making German Middle Ages readable. Okay, from late antiquity, Middle Ages, and for some of you might be from interest, Martina Hartmann, the nowadays, what's happening while this is jumping? Martina Hartmann is now working on opening the project towards early modern. The project was made of normative edition based on manuscripts, reconstructed, eclectic, normalized Latin text. This was in the beginning, the first half, the middle of the 19th century. And then in Usum Scholarum, they made up hand edition, preliminary editions of important texts that we are still missing in some parts of Judaic studies here in Israel. But they were made, first of all, that there will be something to read, that there will be some knowledge about that, even if the full edition will take some more generation. In the end, in the 1920s, there was a methodological shift in the monumenta from eclectic editions to diplomatic editions. And in the 1970s, they began to understand that not every student in Germany reads Latin and so on. So they're beginning to making diplomatic editions with translation. And then again, in the early 2000s, a change in editorial strategy, enabling English. The translation maybe not into German, but into English. This makes it very more accessible for a bigger audience of researchers in the world. So this is the most important series of editions and important studies and tools, and almost everything 2 years back and more is reachable to the Monumenta Germania Digital and the internet, and this makes it very nice even in days of pandemic and so on. Now, okay, so the study series are journal, are all kinds of tools, are especially the series studies and texts is very important as a forum for all kinds of studies, and now in the last years especially around how to make documents from the early modern to historical sources. And now the question is, will there be at sometimes articles, tools of research, studies of manifold kinds in so-called Hebrew matters integrated in this series, or like in the additional series on a separate track? And separate track doesn't sound good in Germany. Okay, so now we have a short look at the series, how it develops and going on. 2003, the idea that there might be a series of Hebrew text came up in Munich. It was first realized by Eva Haberkamp according the 1096 Chronicles, and was made up in crazy conditions. You can see it in addition till now that on some hand it's a true dialogue with the Monumenta. On the other hand, it's still stumbling over every problem that you have with the language, writing in another direction around, and so on and so on. Okay, the second volume was the last example of an eclectic edition in the Monumenta made by Abraham Frenkel, and the translation and the commentary written by me. And the third one is the book, the 2 volumes we are speaking about. Why the second volume is in the series is the third one to appear. Look at these page numbers, okay? It's simply simply took the time of 2 volumes and so on. The next volumes will be, and you can see it here, they are planned to come up. Okay. Rainer Barzen, some of you may know, but he's a student from a Freie University in Berlin, Judaic Studies, had some good teachers there. He went to the University of Trier for the special connection of history, of German history and Jewish history, wrote his PhD dissertation, Taqqanot, Qehillot, Shum, exactly the subject of the book. And now look at the years. Yes, it's almost, let's say 14 years later, 15 years later now, but working in the meantime on project, mapping Ashkenazi Jewry. Every time I have a question, who was living there and where is it and how many places are with this name in Germany with Jewish communities? It takes a few seconds and then Rainer will give the first hint. Now nowadays he's a scientific assistant at the Institute of Jüdische Studien at the Westfälische Wilhelms-Universität Münster. Münster University, they can't say it. They have to put all the names of the kings and so on. But have a look. Taqqanot, Qehillot, Shum. This had changed a little bit from transliteration into German to transliteration of the Encyclopedia Judaica, more or less. Okay, now let's come to the book. There is a 200-year-old tradition of the Monumenta Germania, Germania Historica, study layout. These are books not for reading, but for to study. And this gives them a very complex form. Even the large volumes of the first 100 years were they're cruel to take them over the library to photocopy from them, but now they're in the internet. Okay, but everything in the book that is in classic languages like Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and so on, is in Antiqua. But any vernacular is in italics. If you wondered, if you want to read the book in the beginning, why everything in the introduction is in italics, yes, this was the idea. Italics is representing the vernacular. But these books became a predictable book structure. So this I will shortly introduce and show it in the book. Preliminaria. There is a transcription table for the texts and languages used in the book. There are abbreviations, lists of manuscript sources and research literature consulted. Has something very similar to a dissertation, where everything used should be shown in the bibliography. So if you have a volume of the Monumenta to some subject, you have a good start for a bibliography. The sigla of the edition, yes, this will be some pages in some books you will go back and forth all the time to understand what manuscript is meant with the sigla. Okay. And then there comes an introduction, there comes an edition, here in this book also in synopsis form, indices, English abstract and ratio editionis. This is new, made by, as an idea for Rainer for better contact with the readership, and an additional edition of the same text. And therefore we have to have a look. But first of all, we shall have a look at the structure of the introduction. Historical introduction to the edition, understanding the edition and its present input to historical narratives. This is the first part, and this gives you an orientation, what it's all about and where it's fitting in. Because they are so specialized researchers in the Monumenta that this is a very helpful point, a few pages. Then there are aspects of transmission of the texts used in the edition, description of the sources in manuscript and print. And if you do this 200 years, there is almost no medieval manuscript dealing with German history that is not described in one edition of the Monumenta. This gives good reasons to have a look at it. Then there is a summary of Genesis and reception history. This is already makes the point of the new way Monumenta works now. There's a ratio editionis, ways, and a definition of ways of the translation. Okay. So the first thing we have to understand now that in German philology, Monumenta is now the avant-garde from the durch to the urtext, from the how you eat the hummus. You can do it with a turn, and you can do it straight to the middle. German philology was straight to all the text sources to the urtext, to give the urtext. And this became now in the Monumenta, in the last 70 years, 80 years, to a diplomatic representation of text developments, text in perspectives. And you can see this par excellence in the edition of Rainer. This is not trying to reconstruct one text version at a given time, but to see this text in perspectives of reception, of parallels, and of creative responses to this text. Okay, this is one of the main new ideas of the Monumenta, giving a good readable text that represents the past, but a good readable text to open the world of research. Okay, the first pages are simple, but let's go to the second. The next part. The next part is the Synoptic Edition. And again, here we have the Hebrew text, again, according to different manuscripts. And down below it, we have the Vario Lecciones. We have the different readings or in the different manuscripts groups. And then we have on the other side, the same pebbles of text. So these are even not precious stones. They're so small pieces, bits and pieces. But here we have them in German translation. And then we have a very intricate system of connecting text criticism by letters and annotation and commentary by numbers to both of the texts. So if you're reading Hebrew in the beginning, you're coming to the same commentary, to the same annotations of Rainer as you would come if you read the German text. This is very complicated typesetting, but it was done with bravery by Anton Tanner and by Rainer Barzen. Well, I don't know how many terms you did reading this correction, but the correction sheets, but it was impossible. But then there's another point. Beginning with the edition of Eva Haverkamp, she saw that the synopsis is not giving any readable text. You can study it, you can analyze it, but you can't read it. And so we have some kind of continuous text and continuous translation of the text fragmentized in the synopsis at the end of the books for the main manuscript group. And again, we have the text, the Hebrew text with the Hebrew Vario Lecciones, and we have the German translation. And we should have a look for the commentary now at the study edition in form of the synopsis. Okay, so at this point, to the three aspects of giving a framework for the work of Rainer. Now I would like to ask Micha to connect and if he has a PowerPoint. Okay, I'll leave for a second. And Micha, you go up. Okay. So Micha Perry, Dr. Micha Perry is a senior lecturer of medieval history at the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa. And he has a very interesting line of between his different books, Tradition and Transformation, Knowledge Transmission Among Medieval Jews. And then now Erde travels from the lost tribes to the present, going to tradition history. And now it's going on to something more fascinating even more fascinating for someone dealing with Hebrew literature. This is the language arenas in medieval Judaism. But now, Micha, and I have to thank to all of you who speak up this evening that you choose so interesting and close aspects and not speaking on your home ground, but looking at the book and giving us responses to the book. Okay, Micha.
Peter, thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming. It's a great honor and a pleasure to talk about Reiner's book. Reiner is a good friend and an extraordinary scholar who brings together pedantic archival work with a broad history, watch of history and Hebrew sources and German sources and Latin sources. It's a pleasure to delve into this book and to sink one's teeth into it. I would like to talk a bit about the book, and then I want to give a short example about how we historians could use this book in order to change maybe or to add to what we know up to now about the Taqqanot Shum. This is not my original scholarship. I base myself on other scholars, and I also, because this is a book event, I try to be very brief, and also I'll speak in a very general manner, and even in a bit extremist manner, though you and I, we all know that the picture is much more complicated than this. So we have gathered here to celebrate this new edition of Taqqanot Qehillot Shum, and it's a fabulous edition. For historians, it's a wonderful tool. Just as Petal just explained, it's not easy to use, but it's awarding. And what Rainer did here, this new Barzen edition, from my point of view, it allows us to transform, and even you see it visually, philology into social history. You see how the text evolves and how the text changes through times. And it allows us to see different aspects at different times of the lives of these communities. So it really shows the evaluation of the text, its reductions and reception. Some of the points that really pop up immediately, even just by looking at the book, are the relations between the different Shum communities and the different versions and signatures of people and who controlled who. It goes beyond the scope of Germany and also has much to say about the relation between France and Germany and the reception of the French Taqqanot in Germany and how they were accepted. And beyond the Jewish world, it locates these Taqqanot in their actual non-Jewish environment. And this is mainly in the footnotes that Rainer really enriched us with it. And you could see the actual historical, legal, and cultural background of these Taqqanot. I mentioned one example here. I want to ask myself whether we have a new picture of the Taqqanot, and this joins a revision that has been done in over the last couple of years, but it starts with the image of these Taqqanot as representing Jewish self-government in the Middle Ages. And I want to ask myself whether this is true, whether we do have a Jewish self-government in the Middle Ages. And this was from the early research. This was the Taqqanot were used to exemplify a picture of Jewish democracy. Yitzhak Ber wasn't the first, but this very famous article about the organization of Jewish community from antiquity up to the Middle Ages is a beautiful example of this. And Ber uses the Taqqanot as an exemplary example. These documents, they show the public activity of the community, the authority of the community facing the individuals, and it shows how, in Ber's eyes, these Taqqanot prefer the common good versus the egoistic needs of the individual. They control the individual to the needs of the community. More so, they mark the democratic rule of these communities. And this he contrasted with the non-Jewish environment in which they lived in. And we know today that the picture is much more complicated, and I think that all of you medievalists working with Ashkenaz will agree that the Taqqanot or the Jewish community should be regarded more as sort of a Jewish guild within urban environment, the Christian urban environment. But this view was not led only by Bell. It was shared by most of the scholars who worked in this, obviously by Louis Finkelstein in his edition of the Taqqanot, but also Salo Baron, who criticized Bell and Bell criticized him. But he shared this view. For Salo Baron, the community was a given, a non-changeable entity that went across history from antiquity to modern time. This view, in a smaller scope, was also promoted by Yaakov Katz, whose most of his book about tradition and crisis, the part of tradition is presented by the community, and the community is unchangeable. It stays as a constant through the Middle Ages until the time of the crisis, in 17th century, in the early modern times. You see just the chapters of this entity, the community, how it stays static throughout this time. What I want to do in the few minutes we have left is to examine these Taqqanot and see how through the addition of Rainer, we could try and locate shifts within these communities. And I want to use these Taqqanot to compare what happened since the Taqqanot of Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or Gola to the Taqqanot of Shum. I brought this beautiful manuscript, which Rainer also uses, but mainly has the Taqqanot of Rabbeinu Gershom and Rabbeinu Tam, and you see already this very non-Jewish imagery of the knight fighting the hybrid here and all kind of other hybrids on the side. If we go to Finkelstein's edition and we look at what he saw as the Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or Gola's Taqqanot, and this view is also shared. I took the ones that also Abraham Grossman sees as Rabbeinu Gershom's Taqqanot. We see several examples. We see the ability to summon a stranger to court, even if there's a community examination in that city, meaning the jurisdiction of a local community is expanded also to foreigners who come and visit that community. We see limitations on the power of the I called it call to the public or canceling the prayer, bitula tamid, the power of an individual to appeal to the public and to stop all the religious activity within the synagogue until his demands are met or addressed, at least. So here we see that this already existed, the power of this each individual, and now the community put limitations on it. We see the power of, and this bill uses this incredibly nicely in his article, we see the power of the community to collect taxes and to protect the tax collectors within the community. And even if somebody has a question against a dispute with somebody else in the community or against the community, he has to pay first, and only then his problem will be addressed. So if we try to, and these are just 3 examples, I'll try to sum up as an historian what we could learn from these Rabbeinu Gershom's Taqqanot. We see a community of international merchants. And this has to do with the Takana not to marry 2 women and not to read letters and other Taqqanot. We see limitations and regulation of existing community customs, such as the call to the public or taxation or the rule of mayores. These existed prior to the Taqqanot, and the Taqqanot now try to regulate it, turn it into an halachic issue. We see the establishing of the government and powers of the community facing the individual and other communities. Now, Be'er saw this as the community enforcing itself and on the individual. I see it more as granting the individual power against the tyranny of the majority. In these Taqqanot, the community gives a lot of power to the individual, and I think it has to do with the need to keep people within the community and to address people's problems. If we turn to the Shum Taqqanot, 200 years later, first of all, we see that they repeat the Taqqanot of Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or Gola, and they say, we're going to add, I'm not going to quote all the Taqqanot of Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or Gola, because they are many and they're known. So we don't need to renew them here. But they bring the new Taqqanot. So let's check what are the new Taqqanot. What happened in 1220 that the community had to address? What new problems they had? And this is just as Peter explained, it's much easier to quote from the one text than from the synopsis. The issues are very different. The issues are much more private. For example, these the first Taqqanot are not to share a meal with a post-menstrual woman, bimei libuna, not to have a certain un-Jewish haircut. And Rainer explained very nice all these historical background of these Taqqanot. Not to use a razor, not to wear certain un-Jewish clothes. Again, read Rainer's footnotes. Not to loan money to a Jew unless it's half profit, half loss. Sort of a mechanic how Jew could loan money from another Jew. Not to gamble. Not to store wine in non-Jewish vessels. And many of the Taqqanot address the problem of not to socialize with non-Jews. From a bird-eye view, I think that these Taqqanot deal with something else. They deal with the body, with personal relations between two members of the community, with certain behaviors or customs. I didn't quote the custom of the friends of the bride to steal a chicken. Again, look at Reiner's footnotes. It's fabulous. This is another layer, a personal one, of the body, of certain personal behaviors. And I think these represent much more a shift from self-government, I'll call it, to self-control, controlling the individual's behavior and even thoughts and actions. Now, this shift is part of a European shift. We see this in the 13th century, much more in the 14th century, but already from the beginning of the middle of the 12th century, the rise of the individual as a person, the discovery of the self, increasing religious control over the body, behavior, intent, thoughts, and the inner world of people. But if we look at this within the Jewish context, it also represents a turn of the community. The community now, the field of behavior turns to be the field of control and power of the powerless. The Jews deal no more with controlling other communities or governing the community as a body, and shifts to controlling each individual, his behavior, his thoughts, his body, his clothes, his haircut. As an historian, I think that what I see here is that the political field is substituted with the inner world, within the community, and within the lives, bodies, and behavior and souls of the members of the community. Now, one could claim, yes, but they still copy the old Taqqanot. They still exist, these old Taqqanot. In this case, I think that the old Taqqanot is sort of a masquerade somewhere. The transmission and circulation of these old Taqqanot, especially the old ones, is actually a facade. It's a tool in creating a false sense of Jewish self-government in the eyes of late medieval Jews. And this is also what modern scholars have inherited. So also in the eyes of modern scholarship. And from here, we see this myth of Jewish self-government. I want to end with an example that will portray what I'm trying to say. This is a very known charter. Rainer mentioned this charter in his book. Nothing eludes him. He saw everything. In this case, this is from 1333, and the city council, the Rat of Speyer, confirms the right of the Jewish Rat, of the three men and the head of the Jews, the bishop. And this document, granting self-government, you might say, to the Jews, was bought with a lot of money and was limited only for 10 years. And afterwards, it had to be bought again. So we have to remember that the real power lies in the non-Jewish government, whether it's the city Rat council, whether it's the bishop who owns the city or the count or the emperor. When we look at this document, if we turn it around, on the dorsal, on the back of it, there's in Hebrew inscription. You see it here on the right. And in this Jewish inscription actually summarizes what we have in the document. I'll read it quickly in Hebrew. כאשר כתוב מעבר אשר הסכמנו עם העירונים, כך יש להם לעירונים גם כתב חתום בחותמם, ויהיו קיימים ושרירים עד 10 שנים, ועבור עניין זה אשר כתוב מעבר, נתנו לעירונים 400 ליטרים חליש, לפני השלום קהל שפיירה. It summarized that we have bought whatever is written on the other side for 10 years at this price, and all these Jews signed. So if I want to say metaphorically, you might say, the Taqqanot that Rainer edited so beautifully are this Hebrew text. And we read only the Hebrew side, but we shouldn't forget that this Hebrew side, the Taqqanot, are written on the back of a Latin charter. And Jewish self-government is limited within the approval and government of the non-Jewish authority. And we shouldn't bite into the myth of what the Jews tell themselves and what earlier scholarship told us. Thank you very much.
רחל, מוכנה להעלות את המצגת שלך? Rachel first is a research fellow and adjunct lecturer in medieval Jewish history and Jewish law at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Her work focuses on Jewish law and practice and Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, as well as in history of women and gender. And look at every subject she's dealing with. She knows 10 subjects more. On the right side, on the left side, she decided scrupulously not to write about it. So this is her way of choice and choosing only subjects she wants to write about. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Leonard. Thank you to those who invited me, particularly Dr. Ephraim Shom-Steiner. And of course, thank you most of all to Dr. Rainer Barzen, our guest of honor this evening. Sometime during the first half of the 15th century, Rabbi Israel Israeline, resident of Wiener Neustadt, as well as scholar, decisor, and author of the Responsa collection known as Terumat HaDeshen, ruled on a financial dispute between a man called Simeon and his son-in-law called Reuben. When Reuben married Simeon's daughter, Simeon had promised him a dowry of 100 gulden, or more precisely, Simeon had given Reuben a promissory note for the funds with a fixed date. But Simeon's daughter died before the promissory note was due, and when Reuben subsequently tried to cash it in, Simeon refused to hand over the money, insisting that the deal was no longer in effect following his daughter's death. The case became even more colorful as Reuben retaliated by holding hostage a set of valuable books that his father-in-law had previously procured for him. In his response to this altercation, Rabbi Israeline ruled in favor of the father, Simeon. And after demonstrating how his position was consistent with the development of Jewish law concerning dowries and spousal inheritance rights, which hinges, at least to some extent, on whether and when the dowry actually came into the husband's possession, he appended the following declaration. And this is what you have on the screen before you. And I will also write that which I know concerning the current custom of land in Austria and our surroundings. I have absolutely no knowledge of any fixed custom, neither in the first year following the marriage, nor in the second year. Rather, each time such a situation arose, they would be in doubt about the matter, and no dissemination of a particular custom has become clear. And in the Rhineland and its surroundings, the custom is to always stipulate at the time they establish the betrothal conditions that the couple accepts upon themselves the ordinance of the community. We don't know whether they do this in order to avoid all subsequent challenges and doubts, or whether they need to do this because there too, the dissemination of the custom has not been clarified. And it seems that their communities have renewed, in accordance with customs, ordinances that are not followed by the residents of Austria. The Takana, or ordinance, to which Rabbi Israeline refers here should be familiar to anyone who has had the fortune of engaging with Dr. Barzen's magisterial edition of Taqqanot Qehillot Shum. It is the Takana originally issued by Rabbi Yaakov Tam, and often cited in his name, that sought to limit or adjust the Talmudic law by which a husband is the sole inheritor of his wife's property. And here you have one version of this Takana as presented by Dr. Barzen in his edition. Now, according to the original version of the Takana, which assumes that the dowry is provided by the bride's family, if the woman dies within her first year of marriage without producing live offspring, the dowry is returned to the original owners, that is her family. And as Dr. Barzen has demonstrated, this ordinance was known to the Rhineland communities as early as the turn of the 13th century, around 1200, although precisely when it was incorporated into the official Taqqanot of these communities is not entirely clear, as the different textual witnesses that he has so meticulously collated provide conflicting evidence, ranging from the mid-13th to the early 14th centuries, or perhaps slightly later. In any event, in its Rhenish guise, this Takana was adjusted slightly, and as you can see by following the arrow here, stipulated that only half the dowry was to be returned in the event that the woman died anytime within the first 2 years of her marriage. Now, of all the ordinances included in the many versions of the collection now edited by Dr. Barzen, known as Taqqanot Qehillot Shum, this ordinance, and specifically the variation associated with the Shum communities, has had what is perhaps the longest halachic afterlife. That is to say, this ordinance is one of the few that made its way into the canonical halachic literature, where it was regularly cited in its association with the Shum communities. Thus, for example, in his indispensable 16th century comments on the Shulchan Aruch, the Krakow-based Rabbi Moshe Isserlis wrote, Rabbeinu Tam and the scholars of France further ordained that even if the father has already transferred the dowry, if the wife or the husband die within the first year of marriage without live offspring, the entire amount returns to the father or the inheritors of the dead spouse. And there are those who say that even in the second year of marriage, half the dowry returns. And this is the basic custom in these lands where they practice this matter, like the Taqqanot of the Shum communities. So returning then to the 15th century comments of Rabbi Yisrael Israeline, with which I began, it should strike us as most curious that he considered the dissemination of this specific ordinance to be in doubt, not only in the East German or Austrian communities in which he operated, where in fact there is other evidence for scholars' longstanding resistance to the Takana, but possibly even in the Rhineland, that is, in the Shum communities themselves. Now, before we dismiss this scholar's assessment as mistaken or misinformed, I'd like to suggest that Rabbi Yisrael Israeline's remarks are consistent with a general approach to Taqqanot Qehal, or community ordinances, that we can trace among medieval Ashkenazi scholars, an approach that pertained even, perhaps surprisingly, to the celebrated Taqqanot Shum. And I'd like to use this opportunity to highlight what I consider to be one of the great contributions of Dr. Barzen's scholarship, and that is the way in which it has laid the groundwork for a reevaluation of this genre of halachic writing, which holds so much potential for understanding the inner and outer workings of medieval Jewish communities. But just a few words of background. As Dr. Barzen has points out in his very thorough introduction, community ordinances are generally considered a distinct subcategory of Jewish religious law, at least for the pre-modern period. A takana can be defined as the result of legislative activities of the competent halachic authorities and public bodies in every generation. Legislative activities that were perceived by their proponents as responding to the needs of the time, particularly when interpretation of existing halakha did not suffice. And indeed, Taqqanot were already instituted in Talmudic times and have remained in use throughout Jewish legal history. During the medieval period, Taqqanot continued to be issued by recognized halachic authorities, but another body of legislation emerged known as Taqqanot Qehillot, community ordinances, that were not meant to become universally applicable halachic principles, but rather guiding rules for the specific communities for which they were issued. As Dr. Barzen notes in his introduction, Taqqanot Shum is kind of a cross between the type of Takana issued by prominent legal authorities and those issued by community leaders, which, as in the case of Taqqanot Shum, were often ratified by legal authorities who lent them legal weight. Indeed, the use of the term Takana in the context of community ordinances suggests that these community rules were perceived, at least by the issuing authorities, as a form of Jewish law in the halachic sense. Now, apart from Taqqanot Shum, much of our evidence for the existence of local community ordinances during the medieval period, particularly in Ashkenaz, comes from the responsa literature, that is, from the halachic authorities themselves. And parenthetically, I think this is one way in which the study of Taqqanot from the medieval period differs a bit from Taqqanot in the early modern period, as I hope we'll hear from Dr. Kaplan shortly. But very often, the evidence that halachic authorities provide us for local community ordinances is evidence in the negative. That is, in the course of adjudicating a particular dispute or ruling on a specific case, a respondent will note that he has heard that the litigant's community has a takana to cover such situations, but he himself is not familiar with it. An oft-cited example of this is the response of Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg to a case involving a Jew who had violated community norms and various Taqqanot, including the Takana Rabbeinu Tam that was incorporated into Taqqanot Shum, by suing his fellow Jew in a local non-Jewish court. The litigant in question had been physically attacked by the man he reported to the local authorities, and the Jewish judge who referred the case to Rabbi Meir was unsure how to treat the situation. In his response, Rabbi Meir recalled that during a visit to Würzburg, he had heard that the local Jewish judges would forgive Jews who applied to Gentile courts during a time of rage following a fight or attack, an exemption that they attributed to the rule of the communities. Rabbi Meir himself objected to this exemption and argued that even in such a situation, one who violated Jewish law by appealing to a Gentile court is responsible to compensate his opponent for all the fees that exceeded the damages required by Jewish law. Yet in the end, Rabbi Meir conceded that what I have seen my master's ruling in Würzburg, noting that he conceded to what he had seen his master's ruling in Würzburg, noting that ultimately a court has the authority to impose monetary decisions and confiscate property, and of course, to uphold their own specific ordinances. As a third and final example of this approach to community law, I'd like to turn our attention to another takana of the Shum communities that left a footprint in the halachic record, and that is the takana concerning levirate marriage. Although, as Avram Grossman and other scholars have shown, yibum, levirate marriage itself, was practiced in the medieval German as opposed to French communities until a fairly late date, Khalitza, which is the divorce-like alternative, eventually became the preferred halachic option. The requirement for a widow whose husband had died without leaving offspring to perform the Khalitza ceremony with her brother-in-law before she could move on with her life left many women open to extortion and abuse, as we know from the responsa literature and other sources. The takana in question, which was probably entered into the collection of Taqqanot Shum in 1223 and is associated with the scholar Rabbi David of Münzberg, stipulates that a lever, that is the brother-in-law, may not chain his brother's widow to a dead relationship by depriving her of her due from the estate of the deceased. Instead, he must agree to an equitable division of assets in accordance with various considerations concerning family heirlooms and the like. And as I mentioned previously, this takana, like the takana concerning the return of the dowry that we saw earlier, does get cited in later halachic literature in connection with the Shum communities. Nevertheless, in this instance too, records of law and practice in the responsa literature demonstrate that this takana was not universally recognized or applied by the leading halachic scholars of the day. And one striking example of this is the response of Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg to a late 13th century case concerning a widow from Speyer. According to the local judges who referred the case to Rabbi Meir, the widow and her brother-in-law had been locked in dispute for many days before they finally selected an arbitration panel, and the judges themselves were unsure how to proceed. Rabbi Meir was initially reluctant to rule, recommending that the judges consult local rabbinic authorities who were familiar with the relevant community ordinances, until he looked into the matter further and determined that according to all authorities, the husband's assets should be divided between his widow and his heirs. And here I think Rabbi Meir's language is pertinent. And they asked me what I say about this matter. And I pushed them off and told them to ask the great scholars of the kingdom what the communities had ordained between a widow and her lever. And I saw that they all agreed on the matter, that after the levers perform Khalitza, they must divide the money that the deceased left behind, half for her and half for the levers. And I myself don't know how to adjudicate the Taqqanot of the communities, but in accordance with what my masters wrote, to divide the assets after the Khalitza. I will write what seems correct in my eyes and as I have been guided from the heavens. Now, as Dr. Barzen himself has noted in his commentary on this ordinance, Rabbi Meir does not say that he has never heard of the Takana. And in fact, he seems certain from the outset that there are relevant community ordinances that should govern this case from Speyer. But because he does not initially know the details, and even after looking into the matter, does not consider himself sufficiently schooled in how to parse or apply the ordinance, he refuses, at least initially, to get involved. I want to make clear that in highlighting the hesitation of medieval Ashkenazi scholars to rule in accordance with community ordinances in general and Taqqanot Shum in specific, I do not mean to undercut the value of Taqqanot Qehillot as either historical or halachic sources. The hesitation of medieval scholars like Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg to rule on the basis of Taqqanot, with which he was unfamiliar or whose acceptance in a particular community he could not ascertain, should be read in conjunction with the significant weight he assigned to Taqqanot in his legal rulings in cases where their acceptance by the local community was clear. That is, Rabbi Meir and other scholars did not challenge the legal weight of Taqqanot in principle. They insisted, however, that the Taqqanot were records of legislation whose efficacy derived from their very specific local acceptance and applicability. The fact that medieval scholars related in this manner to Taqqanot Shum, in addition to less famous and less regional ordinances, whose provenance they sometimes could not trace at all, does not diminish the significance of the fact, as Dr. Barzen has so masterfully shown, that Taqqanot Shum were renewed and redisseminated repeatedly throughout the period under question, nor does it diminish from the significance of the fact that Taqqanot Shum served as the basis for numerous later collections of local ordinances. But it does underscore their fundamental nature, at least from the legal scholar's perspective, as community-driven and community-specific legislation. To my mind, this raises some very important questions for trying to understand in still understudied field of halakha, one that has implications for understanding the relationship between rabbis, lay leaders, as well as average community members in making, interpreting, and imposing law. For scholars like myself who are interested and study medieval law in practice and not only law in theory, this has very exciting implications. And Dr. Barzen's edition of Taqqanot Shum is really a gift to those of us who study Jewish law, those of us who study medieval and early modern Jewish history, and many other fields besides. And I look forward to really making even greater use of Dr. Barzen's extensive scholarship in my own research and to take that in new directions. So thank you again very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rachel. And now, Deborah, if you can put up your presentation. Deborah Kaplan is Associate Professor in Jewish History at the Bar-Ilan University. She's dealing with the history of Jewish communities in early modern Europe. Beyond Expulsion was the title of one of her books, Jews, Christian, and Reformation in Strasbourg. And The Patron and the Poor, Jewish Community and Public Charity in Early Modern Germany. She's, I think, all frequent guest in our research community in Beersheba. And I forgot to say that Micha Per will already be once again in 2 weeks or something on a Beersheba event. Okay, so please, Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you to you and to Effie for inviting me. And of course, a huge thank you to Rainer for his wonderful book. I was trying to think about when Rainer and I first started talking about this book, and I came up with Augsburg 17 years ago. So Rainer, you can correct me, but it's such a privilege for me to be here and to share some thoughts. We've heard 3 speakers already, and so I'm going to limit what I say about the book and its overview, and just suffice with saying that this is a really meticulous and comprehensive edition of the Taqqanot. I'll speak about the importance of the Taqqanot in a moment, with an extremely rich and valuable introduction, which I think is really necessary reading for anybody who wants to know anything about Qehillot Shum, about Taqqanot, and about the impact of the Taqqanot into the 14th century and possibly beyond. It's really difficult to underestimate the importance and the value of this book to scholars, and of course of the Taqqanot as a source for understanding medieval Jewish history. And tonight I'd like to focus my remarks on the genre of Taqqanot by comparing some of the differences between the medieval Taqqanot of Qehillot Shum with early modern Taqqanot, a specific set of Taqqanot, which I will discuss in a moment. And I'd like to point to 4 specific differences, each one of which reflects differences in communal life and culture between the medieval and the early modern period. I'm going to be talking about really the 17th and the 18th centuries. Now, although the term Taqqanot is used, and Rachel just mentioned even in the Talmudic period, but certainly in the medieval and early modern period, and for these documents, there are nevertheless several really critical distinctions between the sets of documents that are worth noting, and which points to the evolution of communal organization and of record keeping. So the Taqqanot that I'm going to speak about tonight in honor of Rainer's work come from the area of Shum. And this is a map of the bishopric of Speyer in around 1700. And I'm going to speak about a set of Taqqanot adopted by the Jewish community of this area, starting in 1685 or 86 and going up until 1746. And what you see here is the bishopric of Speyer. Here, I just circled in red the Qehillot Shum that appear on this map, Worms and Speyer. The area in green over here is the bishopric of Speyer, the Hochstief, and if you see the Rhine goes through it, and that's something that comes up quite a bit in the Taqqanot. And as you can see, this is just a very, very different geographic reality, which is one of the differences I'm going to speak about. Just to give a visual sense of that, if you look at the archives in Speyer, in the 17th century, you have this rather short list of taxes on homes, and you can see that this is no longer the rich medieval center, but rather a small community. And indeed, when we look at the Jewish communities in this area of the bishopric of Speyer, which constituted a legal unit and wanted to enact Taqqanot together, it included those Jews living in the city of Speyer, as well as those living in various towns and villages in the countryside. So the first difference that I'd like to discuss is here's a picture of the Taqqanot. And the copy that I have begins, it's from 1746, but it includes Taqqanot starting from 1686 that were then amended in 1699 and again in 1714 and finally in 1746. And I'll talk a little bit about that process. The biggest difference, I believe, that is worth mentioning this evening among my dear friends who are medievalists and early modernists, is really the different demographic realities of these two communities. Rainer did a beautiful job in his book talking about the medieval Taqqanot, which were definitely geared towards the urban communities, but certainly include the smaller settlements around them. So, for example, Rainer talks about the Takana permitting Jews from smaller towns to bury their dead in the urban cemetery, which is a very important Takana. The contents of the early modern Taqqanot, by contrast, reflect a very different demographic situation in the bishopric, where all the Jews live in very, very small communities, even those, as we saw, in Speyer proper. In his rich introduction, Rainer discusses the agreements that were reached between the Jews of Speyer and the city bishop about allowing Jews to reside in the bishopric, and Micha showed us one of these documents, which dates back to the 14th century. But by the 18th century, there is no major community in Speyer at all. And the center with which the Jews of the bishopric interact is actually the community of Worms rather than the community of Speyer. And the Taqqanot reflect this in multiple ways. For example, stressing that the parnasim of this somehow disparate Qehillot need to come from both sides of the Rhine. There need to be representatives from either side of the river. And they have some flexibility on this topic, but it's an extremely important issue to have representation from all the different areas, and so that people have access to the parnasim who serve also as judges. I would say it's such an important element that in one of the emendations of the Taqqanot, they name a specific person, Meir, one of the Tovim of the year, who lived in Kirweil, and he moved to Philipsburg because of the 9 Years' War. And they go to great length in the Takana explaining why it's all right that he moved from one side of the Rhine to the other side of the Rhine, but was still considered a representative from both sides. So this need to balance all aspects of this demographic makeup and to make sure that every resident is near a parnas is something that is a very different kind of Takana than what we see in Rainer's edition. Another example, just to throw one out, is in the ritual sphere. And this is an 18th century emendation, not a 17th century one, which urges women who are living in these small communities to go to a mikvah, a formal mikvah in one of the larger communities, as opposed to immersing in a river or elsewhere. And I think this is very indicative of a place where the farther away mikvaot would not have been as accessible to the women and would have necessitated travel, and is reflected in this new demographic reality, would not have been, of course, as central in medieval Speyer with its wonderful and beautiful mikvah. The second example that I'd like to bring is the question of drafting the Taqqanot, when and where they're drafted. And Rainer explains that it's possible that the Taqqanot were drafted in a synod, and he goes into some length discussing when they are legislated and how they are enacted, and we have different versions of them as well. And this is really different from the early modern period as well, when there's a much more formal process for enacting Taqqanot of the Landsjudendschaft. And again, this is tied to the demographic reality where Jews need to come together from so many different places in order to draft the Taqqanot. They have a Landtag, Yom Havad in Hebrew, a specific day when all of the Jews from the area meet to enact and then amend the Taqqanot if necessary. And permission for this is granted by the bishop. And I'll speak a little bit more about the bishop in a few more moments. There are actually certain instances, and I'll bring an example just here from the archives in Karlsruhe, where permission to meet and enact these Taqqanot was denied to the Jewish community. In this specific instance, at the end of the 17th century, there was a huge communal controversy over the appointment of a local judge named Raphael. His father-in-law was a very influential Jew in the bishopric of Speyer. And what we essentially see is that the bishop says until this controversy is resolved, he will not allow the community to meet and issue Taqqanot, because at the heart of the Taqqanot is the judicial structure of the community. And so we see a much more formal process. We see the archival correspondence about whether and when permission can be granted, and we have multiple letters, such as this one, granting permission or denying permission. And I think the manner in which the Taqqanot are enacted really reflects their more formal nature and the growing process of standardization, which is all part of the burgeoning bureaucracy of the early modern period. To build on that, I'd like to point to a third example of the differences between the medieval and the early modern Taqqanot. And this is the format of the Taqqanot. Now, we've seen, Peter showed us in his remarks the beautiful way that Rainer compares the different manuscripts and how you could really trace the evolution of the text, compare the manuscripts. And I have to admit that I spent several hours reading those comparisons, just watching this. And it's really hard to underestimate how valuable this is. It's hard to use, as was said earlier, but you can really get lost in these nuances. And it's so interesting. And I really urge everybody here to have a look at the way that the Taqqanot evolve, because it's really, really interesting. And there's such a wide range of issues which are annotated by Rainer. You can really get a sense of how this genre evolved within the period and how the manuscripts differ from one another. It's really fascinating. I spent several hours just looking at one set of Taqqanot, and they appear in the longer version as one text that include Taqqanot about various issues, which actually Micha mentioned: dress, hairstyles, wine, food, economics, and marriage practices. And the early modern Taqqanot similarly deal with this wide range of issues, regulating economics, rituals, personal behaviors such as wearing tzitzit, education, and as I mentioned earlier, ritual immersion. Now, the difference, I think, comes in the format. These are compiled more consciously as a set of Taqqanot. And if you look to this slide that I had shown earlier, that is not the slide, give me a moment, you can see that the Taqqanot are numbered. And what's important about this is not just that they're laid out as numbers, but they're construed of as a set, and the actual number of the Taqqanot becomes important. So I'll give an example from, I mentioned earlier, the emendations that could take place every 3 years. Here are one of the emendations, and I'll just show a few. There's a long list. These are the emendations that were adopted in the Synod, and then they just make points to the earlier version. So in point 2, we change this. In point 6, we change this. In point 7, we change that. And if something doesn't get changed, it doesn't get changed. But it's really construed up as a numbered set of laws, which is different from the intricacies that you can see through Rainer's meticulous work, but the format is nevertheless different. I'll give you one more striking example of the format. Here you see one of the Taqqanot is circled, and it's really interesting because there's a sort of footnote, an addendum to the Taqqanot, which says, and here's the Hebrew, but I'll read it in English. What is written 2 lines above was written in error, and a circle was drawn around it to demonstrate that it is extraneous. And I think what's wonderful about this is this error was made in 1685 or 1686, and in the 1740s, they're copying the Taqqanot, they're drawing the circle, they're writing down that this was extraneous, and all of this is meticulously copied. The error is maintained. And this is extremely important to maintaining the chain of the law and its evolution. I think that these examples too point to the centrality of record keeping to the Jewish community, and specifically and also more broadly to the community in early modern Europe. Almost every community, whether large or small, would have a formally drafted set of Taqqanot, and the form that these take is essential to the document. It's not just the content. And these are just part of a larger trend of documenting, archiving, and regulating that is critical to the 17th and certainly the 18th century. And I would also note that the standardization that I mentioned earlier, together with the formal record keeping that I just mentioned, are part of a larger development. And I think an important one that draws some of the nuances that really come out in Rainer's work, the question of what is the legal culture of the time period. Here we see, I think, the legal culture of the 18th century, which builds on codification and formal processes for adjudication. And as I mentioned, some of the Taqqanot in this early modern period deal very extensively with the court system in the Jewish communities. Which case will be heard by a parnas, which case will be heard from judges in which community, which judges, which parnasim, how the judges should be appointed, and when a community member can bring a case on appeal to the Rabbi of Worms. And this is a very developed systemized system that, if we contrast it to the work of my dear colleague Rachel first, shows a more systematic regulation of the court than we do in the medieval court. And I think by reading these Taqqanot side by side, what I was struck by reading Rainer's book was how nuanced each period is, how we have this concept of Taqqanot, but how the nature of Taqqanot evolves within the medieval period, and then again throughout the early modern period. And we use the same words to describe them, Taqqanot, and many of the same themes emerge, and yet the nuance in what exactly is meant by legal bylaws, by communal enactments, shifts over time. Finally, I'd like to point to one last example. There are many more, but we have to limit what we say. And that is who is responsible for drafting the Taqqanot. And Rainer does a beautiful job, and we heard some of it earlier mentioned by Micha, discussing the medieval Taqqanot. As Rachel mentioned, many of them are attributed to a particular rabbi, but some of the Taqqanot Qehillot Shum are communal legislations made by the Tovei Ha'ir, and there's a very extensive discussion of this in Rainer's introduction, which I warmly recommend to everybody here. These Taqqanot are quoted elsewhere, and as Rainer notes, these bylaws are important, therefore, not only to the Qehillot of Shum, but they tell us all about the relationships between the different communities of Shum, as well as the relationships with other communities such as Cologne, France, the Veterau, and all of this is discussed extensively in Rainer's beautiful book. The early modern Taqqanot are a bit different. Again, there are some similarities, but there seem to be an evolution. They seem to have been drafted by the communal leadership, so in some sense similar to those of Qehillot Shum, with, again, the approval of a rabbi. Here, the rabbi of Worms, not one of the larger rabbis, but whoever was serving as the official rabbi, because the rabbi of Worms served as the official rabbi to the Jews of the bishopric of Speyer into the second half of the 18th century. And I think more work really needs to be done to think about whether this is a mere technicality of approval or whether the rabbi is at all involved in drafting the content. But when we look closely, when we do a deeper dive into some of the Taqqanot, we can see that some of them were actually decided not really by the community itself, but were determined by the bishop. So not only did the bishop grant permission for the Jews to meet at the Yom HaVa'ad, but he also signed off on the Taqqanot, and they were probably provided to him in a translation, because there are examples of this in many other archives. You see this, for example, in Hamburg. But he also makes specific demands on the Jewish community, which are expressed explicitly in the Taqqanot. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting. It comes up in the context of jurisprudence, and you have the Hebrew Yiddish beside. The language of the Taqqanot is, of course, another major difference, but I decided not to talk about that and to talk about legal culture. Takana number 45. We also agreed, since our Lord the Bishop, may he be exalted, commanded all the Jews in the bishopric of Speyer to install a judge in our Medina, our regional community. Therefore, we have installed for good the Aluf and Katzin, the Honorable Rabbi Zanvil Kirweiler, as the Dayan HaMedina, the regional judge, because he is at all times connected to our Honorable Lord and was willing to carry the burden in our honorable region during the war. And so what we see here, and it's part of a much larger, more complex history of how the judicial system worked for this Landjudenschaft, which is really fascinating in its own right. But we see here a demand by the bishop that there be a local judge, someone the Jews can turn to before they go to the rabbi of Worms, and this is for political reasons. And the Jews put that in explicit language into their Takana and actually appoint someone who has a close relationship to the bishop. Now, as we heard also from Micha, Rainer has a beautiful section noting the larger non-Jewish context of the Taqqanot. And because Micha spoke about this, and I was going to speak about some of that too, I'm going to skip what Micha already said and just provide a different example. At the end of the 13th century, we see King Rudolf leverage the federation between the Rhineland communities for his own financial dealings with the Jewish communities. And so we see this knowledge that he has of the networks in Shum and the importance of the Qehillot Shum and its networking to the Christian authorities and the way that they really interact. And that comes across so beautifully in this book in many ways. This is just one example. Micha shared another, and there are more examples as well. But I think that what we see in the 18th century is a bit different. It's not just that the Christian authority is aware of the intercommunal networks, they're directly involved in the content of communal legislation. The intervention by the bishop are part and parcel of the 18th century political culture when local authorities tried to consolidate power over their residents, including the Jews. And I think that this is a very important distinction. And again, helps us tease out some of the nuances of what we see in Shum in the 12th century, in the 13th century, in the 14th century. Recognizing the evolution of Taqqanot over time is simply critical to understanding the evolution of the Jewish community and its organization. We can trace demographic changes and their impact on daily life, changes in bureaucratic and legal procedures, in record keeping, in the structure of communal leadership, and in relations between the Jewish community and the state power. The differences between the medieval and early modern Taqqanot, despite their common names and terminology, reiterate the importance of Taqqanot as a source and the need to dive deeply into what we mean when we use communal and legal terms. While their names stayed static, their meanings shifted over time. And I think this is a point that really comes across when you look at the different versions that Rainer compares and sees the evolution of Taqqanot Shum. Rainer's book provides comprehensive access to these medieval Taqqanot and is a very important contribution to scholarship. Again, Rainer, want to congratulate you warmly for making this significant source available to us and to future generations of scholars and students. This book will surely enhance our knowledge about and our appreciation for medieval communities of Shum and their legal and organizational structures. Thank you.
So, Rainer, if you are speechless now, it will be good with the time, but we still want to listen to your response.
Well, yeah, first of all, yeah, thank you. I mean, I have here prepared a few words and I try to make it a little bit shorter. We will see. Yes, friends, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, all visitors who come here tonight. It is a great joy and honor to receive this acknowledgement from you and such appreciation for my work and especially for this book in particular. And I'm delighted that you have understood so well, perhaps even better and more deeply than I, what has moved, motivated and inspired me while writing the book for all these years. But I will say more about this later. First, I would like to thank our host this evening, the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. We are all privileged to be their guests tonight. And I would also like to give special thanks above all to my dear friend, Professor Ephraim Shoham Steiner, Chaver Ahuv Ve'Yakar B'chol HaShanim, who made the celebration this evening happen. I would also like to give special thanks to my 4 colleagues and friends, Dr. Peter Lehnert, Dr. Rachel Fürst, yes, I say Fürst, Professor Deborah Kaplan, and Dr. Micha Perry, who have honored me deeply by speaking about my book and on the subjects of Taqqanot, Halacha, and Jewish community organization. And last parts of the book being presented here this evening were created in the reading room of the National Library. And I also see you 4 as a representatives of that reading room. This work is not just about the books in the National Library collection, it also represents the people who interact there, working together in the pursuit of knowledge. I would like now to respond briefly to your remarks, really briefly, but knowing that I cannot do justice to all of your scholarship this evening, please accept this small gesture as an attempt to express my gratitude for your great gift. And now I have to change the order because you changed the order. Yeah, start with Peter. Peter, I'm extremely happy how clearly you can explain what I have done here to present to present listeners and future readers. How I have used historical research to explore a halachic text in a historic development in context. The connection between halacha and historiography has thus found its place in the Monumenta Germana Historica. Thank you for your explanation, which have made many aspects of my book clearer even to me. Micha, thank you very much for your words and appreciations and the great prospects of the Taqqanot Shum edition, which you have made clear to all of us with your remarks and your suggestion that there was a transformation within the perspective of Jewish leadership, whose scope of action was limited to their control over their own community and at least to self-control, and how this became visible in the Taqqanot has given me much food for thought. And yes, and what we also spoke about, the circulation of the Taqqanot to Eastern Europe, which I was able to illustrate to employing textual history as a tool for creating a false sense of Jewish self-government in the late Middle Ages and in modern scholarship. Here, for me, the question needs to be raised: what did Jewish self-government want to be in pre-modern times, and what could it be? Unfortunately, we can't discuss this question here this evening, but we will discuss it. And thank you for your remarks. Yes, and now Deborah, right?
Oh,
Rachel. Oh dear, now I'm completely mixed up. My dear Rachel, here Rachel. Rachel, you talked to us about the section of the Taqqanot that relate to the Jewish code of law, and I see your representation today as an example of how adopting a more halakhic perspective can be useful and fruitful for historical research. I thank you very much for your remarks and also for your presentation. And then Deborah, right? Yes, Deborah. The similarity, Deborah, between our approaches and perspectives on research is not new to either of us. Even if we are interested in different time periods, I in the Middle Ages mainly, and you in the early modern age, so far, the organization of the Jewish community space and everyday life is based on halachic and regional Gentile sources is our shared focus and common interest. And I'm fascinated by your discussion of the longue durée in your remarks, and this is one part of what connects our research. Thank you very much for your remarks and your presentation, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and hearing your findings about the 18th century Taqqanot Speyer. Yes, I managed every four of you, right? Okay. So thank you again to all four of you. It is a great honor for me, indeed it is, to have you speaking here tonight. And now, in a few minutes, I would also like to take the opportunity, as Peter has urged and inspired me to do, to say a few sentences about my book myself and highlight a few things about it that are important to me. I've already thanked the many people who helped me along on this journey from Trier to Jerusalem, where I spent 8 years, and to Münster in detail and in the forward, so I will not repeat this here. However, I do owe my thanks to the Monumenta Germania Historica and the Israeli Academy of Science for supervising the publication and including the edition in their series. A book like my edition of the Taqqanot has both an external outcome and an internal history. And I would like to summarize the external outcome as follows, and we have already heard a lot about this evening. The edition started with the idea to write a history of the connection between the three communities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. The text of the Taqqanot Shum then became the center of attention because, among other reasons, this text is an expressive written manifestation of the connection between these communities. An edition was initially created that would in turn become the basis for further understanding the historical connection between the Shum communities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. This is for me the key sentence of it: textual history as community history. This is what I did. And you can go also further, saying textual history as regional history, as Jewish cultural history, especially when you think about the transmission of this community, of this Taqqanot to Eastern Europe. And the various ramifications of her work became apparent as the edition was being compiled, and their internal connections have been already acknowledged in detail, considered further by Peter, by Deborah, and also by Micha and by Rachel. But the book's inner journey was no less varied. When a friend of mine who does not work in the humanities asked me what the Taqqanot edition meant to me, I answered something like this. Everything I know in my approach to the history of the Jewish people and its perception and self-perception, I learned while writing this book. While that might not be entirely correct, it is very true. It opened doors to many areas for me, including various kinds of literature, that the already mentioned perspective to Eastern Europe and the developments in the early modern period, Piyutim, the liturgy of the synagogue, Slichot, which not only occupy my mind, but make my heart joyful and light. I also wrote this book as one builds a great palace or castle, which like any large building has to be built step by step and with great effort. Along with the joy of discovery, there were also quiet moments which embodied the happiness of a scholar feels when they are engrossed in their material. I remember evenings when I was alone in the reading room, working on notes with a feeling of such satisfaction before the open folios of the Shulchan Aruch. And so we need to see the scholar as a happy person, even if he sometimes sees himself as a relative of Sisyphus. In this way, many thoughts entered and remained in the edition notes, which are not, strictly speaking, part of the main topic of the Taqqanot text. There are like treasures that were discovered by chance along the way. I hope that many of these treasures will be examined, if not by me, then by the others, historians of Jewish history, historians of halakha, medievalists, historians of law, and other interested readers who go on a journey through my book. And so, as the formal part of this evening draws to a close, I would like to thank all of you who have honored me with your presence today, and thank you for coming. תודה רבה לכולכם באופן מיוחד, לא רק שבאתם, אלא גם בשביל המתנה הגדולה שנתתם לי, וגם לכבוד הגדול שנתתם לי להיות כאן היום בערב. I wish you all here a good night, and to all of you who have also joined us from the United States, a good day. Und euch allen aus Deutschland und aus Österreich vielen Dank für euer Kommen. So, für uns alle, for all of us, Lekulanu, Laila Tov, good night und eine gute Nacht. Laila Tov. Ken, maybe Peter or Effie would like to say something to conclude.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the moving words. And second, to the three speakers tonight that spoke to the subject, to the book, to the project, and made it so clear that this edition is putting text into perspectives. And this is exactly what the Monumenta was doing in the last 30 years, and trying to encourage young researchers to do for the next generations, to create, on the one hand, intrinsic net of information and data and so on, but keep it in a complex form that make it open for new readings and for continuing reading this text. That this edition is eventually never finished. Yes, and this is hard to say the sentence to you that you worked so many years on it, but now the edition is finished, but the reading of the edition is just beginning.
Yes, right.
Yes,
right.
Okay, thank you for the book, and thank you for joining us from all over and having an interest in this very special subject of Taqqanot Shum. But I think there's also a methodological input that we could already experience this evening. So when we planned it a year ago, we had no idea what would be this evening, but again, it was very exciting to see you all over. You're all over here. Okay, so we are only 30 minutes late. So good night if someone has got families and so on around. But I think this is a very prominent example that scholarship can create communities. Okay, thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much. תודה רבה.
תודה רבה לכם.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב.
ריינר היה נהדר, פשוט נהדר. תודה לכולכם, היה
ערב מיוחד, כן,
ממש,
תודה רבה.
ממש. I wouldn't miss this for the world.
כולם באים ביחד בזוכך.
ממש.
כן, עכשיו אני מזמין את כולכם לאיזה מסיבה בנחלאות. מה אנחנו עושים? כן, זה פשוט...
בעזרת השם יותר מהר ממה שאתה חושב.
כן, בעזרת השם. יותר
מהר ממה שאתה חושב.
מה שנקרא נעלה על טיל ונגיע.
נו, מה, טילים היו לנו, רצנו כבר.
אני מסתכל קדימה. אני אומר, אני שם את הנעץ שלי על סוף הקיץ. בסדר? סוף הקיץ. בירה של סוף הקיץ אצלי בגינה, בעזרת השם.
בעזרת השם, בעזרת השם. כן. תודה רבה, תודה רבה.
אוקיי,
תודה לכולכם.
תודה רבה למארגנים.
מזל טוב.
כן.
תודה.
תודה.
תודה חבר, ביי.
כל כך יפה שאתה פה.
רחל ודברה, זה היה...
רחל, גם פה.
כן, תודה לכם על ההזדמנות.
גרצה, גם פה. אני צריך עכשיו לראות מי עדיין פה, כן. כן, פה, המשפחה, פראו שמיט, איפה ביסטו, איפה את? במדריד או איפה את?
לא, במדריד.
במדריד, כן, לא בטולדו. פראו שמיט is in מדריד, יש אפילו חליצה, כן. יופי, טוב לראות אתכם.
רחל, רק חצי מילה, היה בסדר היום? תקשיבי, היה לך יום...
העיקר שזה נגמר.
I tip my hat, doctor first. I tip my hat.
התחייבתי אליכם הרבה לפני, אז...
לא, בכל זאת, I tip my hat. This effort does not go unnoticed, I should say.
עכשיו אני הולכת לישון.
בדיוק.
כן, נתחיל לישון.
באמת, כל הכבוד, יישר כוח ריינר, ומזל טוב, ותודה לכולכם.
יופי. להתראות חבר'ה. תודה רבה, המון תודה על מה שעשיתם. תודה רבה, לערב היפה הזה. לילה טוב, כן, יופי. Ja, danke dir nochmal, Peter. Eine gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht.